But thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, I really appreciate you taking your time out to come chat with me. I think that you are a huge figure on social media, right? So many people love your page and come to your page just to get insight, which I think is kind of almost the new wave, right, of
Right.
therapy. Like I try to tell people, like, hey, this is not therapy, we're not your therapist, but here are some tips that you can try to implement. So I'm sure you get that all the time, like, hey, therapist,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But before we get into the topic we want to chat about, let people know who you are, what you do, and how they can find you.
So, hi everyone. My name is Minaa B. I am a licensed mental health professional. I am a former therapist. I've worked with clients for 9 years, treating clients who struggle with depression, anxiety, and trauma. Now, I've moved on to doing macro level work where I run a mental health consulting agency, and people can find me at my website, www.minaab.com, to learn more about my services. But you can also find me on social media, MINAA_B.
Look, Minaa B and Amber D. I just thought about that when
Yeah.
you said it. I was like, oh, look at that.
Right? We got some vibes here.
Yeah. All right. So we're talking today about the client and therapist relationship, right? And how that works, how it evolves. And like with any relationship, there's some ebbs and flows, there's some ups and downs. And one of our followers wrote in and said she felt guilty about having an argument with her therapist, but she really felt strongly about what the argument was about. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Should she feel guilty about it? But first, let's talk about the relationship between the client and the therapist. How should that look? Or is it a certain way that it's supposed to look?
I think it looks different for everyone. And the only reason why I say that is because I think everyone approaches therapy differently and everyone has a different need and desire that they're seeking from the therapeutic relationship. So, to me, I think the common factors across the board that a person should see in that therapeutic relationship is a sense of safety, because if you can't share vulnerable, intimate things with your therapist, then it's kind of like, why are you here?
Mhm.
Like this needs to be a safe space where your therapist can be a safe container where this is why you're seeking therapy. You're not seeking a friend's advice. You're not going to someone else to get their opinion. You're going to a professional who can give you professional insight about whatever problems you're presenting. But first, you want to be able to feel safe enough to present those problems. So you don't want to feel judged. You don't want to feel like your therapist is talking down to you. As an adult, I don't think anyone wants to feel like they're being treated like a child or being spoken to in a childlike manner or even being degraded in any sort of manner. I think regardless of any relationship we enter in, there needs to be some level of respect. And I think that that is at the core of any therapeutic relationship. But I do think there are some people who are like, well, I need a therapist who doesn't ask me so many questions, but they just listen and they give me homework. Where some people will say, well, I do need a therapist who asks a lot of questions, but maybe I can skip out on the homework. So I think that's also a part of the therapeutic relationship. And I think that that part, I think, is specific to a therapist modality, because someone who is more psychoanalytic might be asking you more in-depth questions compared to someone who doesn't have more of a psychoanalytic approach. Or if someone who is focusing on cognitive behavioral therapy, they might be giving you a lot of homework and exercises compared to someone who practices a different modality. But that also plays a role in a therapeutic relationship. It's just that the therapist is practicing a different modality. So I think that that's just a distinction. And I think that's where it might differ depending on who is in therapy. But I do think the foundation should be a level of safety, and trust is built over time when you can feel safe talking to your therapist.
Yeah. So should if they already know, I want someone to tell me what to do, I want someone to give me homework, I want someone to ask me a ton of questions, should they look for that before they even book a therapist?
Absolutely. I think that one of the things I always tell people is when you are seeking a therapist, it's very common for a therapist to offer a consultation, but ask. Ask them if they offer a consultation call so that you can ask them those types of questions and say, this is what I think I need from the therapeutic relationship. So, can you tell me your style of therapy? Because I personally think I need someone who's going to challenge me, or I need someone who, depending on some of the issues I have, I need someone who's going to ask me really reflective questions to help me think deeply. I need someone who's going to give me homework, or you might say, homework's not for me. I doubt I'm going to work on certain things outside of the session. So, what can we do that's more practical in session? So, I think during those consultation calls, you can get a feel of how the therapist approaches the therapeutic relationship and their style. And I think that can be the best time to really do your research and understand before you dive into that first session.
I love that. I think that's a key nugget that a lot of people need to
Yeah.
hear. But I have been hearing some therapists aren't offering those discovery calls
Mm.
anymore. So booked and busy therapists. But
Booked and busy. I know, like, especially with these last 2 years in COVID, that's why I'm always like, it's so like typically I know therapists are offering these consultation calls because also it's a benefit to the therapist
therapists,
so that
yeah.
you can know,
Hmm.
but I think people are trying to cut corners because of time, because
Right.
these consultation calls do sometimes cut in with clients and being able to maintain their caseload.
Right.
So I will say to people, if you come across a therapist that you really like, they're not offering a consultation call and they're like, listen, you would just have to book your first session, fill out the first session. I think sometimes people go into therapy thinking they're signing their lives away. And the moment they get into this agreement and they sign a contract with a therapist, they think that they're obligated to stay there.
Hmm.
And really, that contract is, going over HIPAA laws and just the logistics of how that therapist runs their business. You're not necessarily saying, I vow to commit to this therapeutic
Right.
relationship forever. That's not the paperwork you're signing.
Right.
So I would encourage people, if you do come across someone who's not offering the discovery calls, just fill out the first session because, hey, the first session is often longer anyway than
Mm-mm.
a discovery call. See how that works. And if you're not feeling the therapist, it's okay to move on from there.
Yep. I love, 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 love that you said that because they need to know that like you don't have to
Yeah.
be there. If and I always say like if it's like dating, you don't necessarily
Right.
go with the first person that you go on a date with. So you got to find someone that you gel with. But going back to with the person that said that they had an argument with the therapist, what is a reason that someone would argue with their therapist?
See, this is a really good question because I'm wondering, was this an argument or was this a disagreement? And I think often there are times where a therapist can feel strongly opinionated about a particular issue, or maybe they're doing an assessment. And I think sometimes what's common for many clients, and I think this is work a lot of therapists may have to do as well, is a client might have pushback or they might just disagree. And I think it can be really hard when you're in a situation with a therapist and they're giving you insight and they're giving you feedback that you don't agree with. And it feels like your therapist is refusing to hear your side. So when I say an argument, because it takes two often to argue, right? So like, are you just yelling and screaming and the person is just sitting there? Because to me, it's like, all right, when I think of an argument, generally two people are upholding that argument. But I do think that when a person feels like they're arguing with their therapist, to me, what I'm hearing is you had a strong disagreement and maybe your tone, maybe your language, maybe there was some defensiveness, maybe there was some blame. Maybe there was some name calling. And is this why the person may feel guilty around how they handled the conversation? Because maybe it went against their value system. So maybe for them, this is not how I approach conflict. This is not how I approach conversation. So I feel like maybe I came out of character with my therapist, and this is why I feel guilty around it. But I do think when I'm thinking about that therapeutic relationship, I'm often thinking of there should be a space where a client can disagree
Right.
with their therapist. I think that's very important. So I think when you get to a level where the first step is we're having a disagreement, but now it's turning into a full-blown argument, that brings up some concern for me that the therapist must be refusing to hear the needs of the client, because I don't think anything should ever escalate to a point where a client has to argue with you. Now, there are some people, however, and I've been in these situations that they are naturally combative. And that's probably why they're in therapy, especially if they're dealing with anger management. They don't know how to have healthy conversations. So the moment you say, I have a different perspective, they're yelling, they're screaming, they're name calling, because that's how they engage in conversation. So I think that's something to assess as well, how we communicate, and also assessing maybe that guilt is there because we are working on that communication. And that's probably why or how our language manifested the way it did when we were having that argument.
Yeah. Is it common for people to have arguments with or disagreements with their therapist?
It's very common. It's very common to have a disagreement with your therapist. I think that it's natural. I think people hear the word therapist and so they get placed on a pedestal. And a lot of people assume that since this insight or opinion is coming directly from my therapist, this must be truth. And I must treat it as truth. And so we feel like even if we disagree, I think there are a lot of people who stifle how they feel versus people who are learning the skills that they need to speak up for themselves and say, you know what? I actually disagree with you when you shared your opinion around this, or I don't think you understood what I said when I was expressing this emotion or situation because I don't agree with your assessment or your analysis around what happened. And I think that's normal and I think that's healthy because in any relationship, think about it. I think that if you are not having disagreements at all, then it concerns me that you are someone who may have some people pleasing tendencies. And so you're stifling your own needs and desires, and you're probably a conflict avoidant, hence the people pleasing tendencies. And so you're concerned more about your therapist's feelings. So you keep those emotions suppressed instead of challenging it and allowing yourself to see, well, I wonder how my therapist will react if I say I disagree. Because that also shows you, again, the therapeutic relationship. Is this a safe space? Because I think a healthy therapist, someone who's practicing from a lens of recognizing that they're not always going to be right, and we're always supposed to be doing the work of understanding the client's needs, I think it can be very important to listen to what the client has to say. And if they disagree with us, have an open conversation around it.
Yeah. So what if you realize, or even just hearing what you just said, and maybe it's a light bulb that goes off to someone in the audience, like, oh yeah, maybe it is that I am a people pleaser, and I really don't want to have any conflict with my therapist or even push back with my therapist. How can someone address those issues with their therapist, even though they are conflict avoidant?
I think one of the best ways I encourage people to address those issues is actually outside of the therapeutic relationship. And what I mean by that is engaging in certain skills and practices. So, for example, I'll encourage clients to say, go home and journal what you've been truly feeling, and then bring that journal back to me and read it, right? Go home and record yourself saying what you needed to say, and then come back and bring the recording and play it. Because I think in those moments, what happens is people's fight or flight responses start to get triggered, especially if you are used to being in unsafe relationships. And I think what ends up happening is people freeze and they shut down in the moment. So when you are in a position where you feel safe and where you feel comfortable, how can you learn to release those thoughts and feelings? And I often think the best way is to write them down or do audio journaling so that you can express what you really want to say without filtering, and then bring it back to the session. Write your therapist a letter. Write a note that you've been wanting to share with your therapist and bring it back so that in that moment, you are not feeling stifled, you're not feeling frozen, you're not feeling your body shut down. And now the words you actually wanted to say, your tongue is literally not moving and you're stuck. And here you are people pleasing again because your body is in fight or flight mode because your mind is telling yourself that this might not be a safe space for me to share my thoughts. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is you can say that to your therapist and allow your therapist to give you the skills to approach them. So you may not say the thing you want to say, but you might say, you know what, there are certain things that have been happening in our session that I've been struggling with, but I'm scared to tell you. You don't have to say what it is as of yet, but allow your therapist to guide you so that you can start to recognize, oh, shoot, I'm not unsafe in this moment. Because people who have people-pleasing tendencies, it's a trauma response. And also we use that as coping mechanisms, like I said, when we are scared of conflict. And often we're scared of conflict because we're scared of the emotional responses that people are going to have toward us regarding the things that we say or express. So I often encourage too, allow your therapist to guide you on that journey by just saying to them, there are certain things that I want to talk about that I've been really afraid of because I'm concerned of how you might respond. And your therapist will probably know how to guide you and ask you the right questions and give you the skills to help you feel safe so that you can start opening up about those issues.
You know, excuse me, one thing that you just said, it made me think about, because we have, people in the audience that just want to talk about therapy or, have mental health concerns or whatever. But we also have therapists that follow us. So I am thinking, like, with you saying that allow the therapist to give you those skills, how can on a therapist standpoint, on the therapist side of it, if they do have someone that is kind of combative or maybe argumentative with them, how do you have any recommendations or tips on how a therapist can address that client?
Yeah, I think that I'm always about naming what's happening because often I think people move through the world through their own lens, especially through their own trauma lens, and they're not used to being called out. Mm-hmm. I remember even myself, who I had a client who was like that. Literally, the moment I said hello to the client, it was combativeness. But one of the things I had to say to the client, it's interesting how you talk so much about not wanting to do these sessions, but you show up. Mm-hmm. So help me understand why you're here. And I think one of the things we as therapists have to do is we kind of have to put it back on the client. And don't take it as a personal attack. Right. Because this is where we need supervision and understanding transference and countertransference, because sometimes when you're not used to that type of therapeutic relationship and you have someone who's being rude and aggressive, it can feel very personal. Like how do you speak to me like that? Right. And it's like, and I remember even in my own work, I had to realize all of this anger it's not about me. This is literally how my client moves through the world, but my client is not recognizing that there's consequence to it. And so one of the things that I would do is, one, assess the behavior and put it back on the client. It's interesting that you are expressing this, but you're still showing up to your sessions. Tell me why that is, right? Helping the client reflect on, well, it is true. I'm being so combative for whatever reason it is, but I'm still engaging in a session. I'm still scheduling these appointments and actually showing up. But then when I get there, I'm cursing and yelling and screaming that I don't want to be here. Why did you show up? I also think another thing that's really important for therapists to be doing in these sessions as well is helping clients recognize boundaries. So I will also say to a client, if it's very difficult for you to commit to a session, or, if you are going to show up 30 minutes late to a session, I am going to have to cancel our session. Being very strong with whatever the practice boundaries are, or whatever your boundaries are as a therapist, expressing that to the client. I think sometimes we think we're pushing the client away, but what we're really doing is helping that client understand what it looks like to build nurturing relationships, but through empathy. Because even the client that I'm talking about, this particular client was used to being combative with everyone.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I realized was when this client was talking to me, the moment this person got very vulnerable, I got cursed out. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I realized this person was afraid of getting close to me. And this person was afraid of being vulnerable because this person had shared with me their history and therapy and how it did not work out for them. And so I started to recognize a pattern here.
Mm-hmm.
They want to be here, but they're afraid of being here. They're afraid of what that therapeutic relationship could look like when we get close.
Mm-hmm.
But that takes introspection on my end. I didn't expect my client to have that analysis or introspection. And I think what the first step I had to do was, one, not take their behavior personally or as a personal attack. And two, I had to do the deeper work of really reflecting and name calling and saying, I notice you get defensive when. I notice you start to raise your voice when. I notice you become very argumentative when. And that helped the client to do some introspection on their own end as well. And I think as therapists, we have to be willing to go there. But doing it in a way that's clearly empathetic and safe and not, well, you said this to me. And so don't be coming to my session thinking you like, because don't don't do that, y'all. Don't do that.
Don't
Okay.
do that. Yeah, no.
Don't do that. But do it in a way that's warming and empathetic. But our clients do need to be challenged, and our clients need to say, I noticed there's a pattern here. You've shared with me that you struggle with relationships. So what are some of the tools that you think you could be doing differently in our sessions? How do you think your behavior keeps you disconnected from people? Think about the way you approach me in our sessions. Put it back. I always say, put it back on the client for them to reflect. And that's work they have to do. It might take them months to do the reflective work,
Right.
but that's work that they have to be willing to do.
Yeah. With the question that we received, she said she felt guilty about arguing. Is that something that she should feel guilty about? Like and then it could have been, like you said, we don't know if it was an argument or disagreement or, differences of opinion, however it played out. But how could she not feel guilty about voicing her concerns to the therapist? Like, I didn't agree with you here, or however, or whatever that, may have been with her. How could she not feel guilty for her feelings towards what happened or what was communicated?
So two things come to mind, because guilt means I did something bad.
Right.
So I feel like the most I would want this person to do is do some self-reflecting on what they actually feel bad about. Do you feel bad that you stood your ground and expressed your feelings and concerns to a therapist? Because then I would challenge you to think, well, why is that a bad thing? Why is expressing your feelings a bad thing? Why is speaking up for yourself a bad thing? Like, sometimes we literally have to go that deep and really challenge our thought process, because guilt is something a lot of us are conditioned to feel when we are owning our truth and speaking up for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so that's the first layer to it. Like, what is bad about owning your truth? What is bad about expressing your needs to your therapist? The other part, however, is owning the fact that sometimes we do things that could be inappropriate or could be bad or could be out of alignment with our character. And that's the part here that I would want this person to reflect on as well. Is it that you feel bad that you expressed yourself, or do you feel guilty because for you and the path you're trying to be on, you may feel like you stepped out of alignment and you stepped away from your values and you communicated in a way that you aren't proud of? I think that's normal. I think sometimes we can reflect and say, you know what, I wish I would have handled that disagreement differently. Right. I wish I would have communicated my needs differently. I wish I wouldn't have raised my voice, because instead of that person hearing me, They immediately got defensive because I was attacking them.
Yeah.
So I think this is why I think it's twofold that I would want this person who asked this question to think of. Is it that you feel bad that you owned your truth and spoke up for yourself? Versus, is it that you feel like you stepped away from your values and you stepped out of character, and maybe there's some guilt there because you realize, I've really, in retrospect, I feel uncomfortable with the way I handled that. And I want to say, if that is the case, I want this person to know that you can, accountability looks like owning your mistakes, owning your actions, and having a conversation about it. And so if it is that you feel like, I have to admit, I started cursing my therapist out. I started yelling and I started cussing and I started screaming, and that's not who I am. And I didn't think my therapist deserved that, but I admit I was angry. You can always go back to that therapist and say, let's talk about what happened. Now, actually, I think your therapist would probably revisit that, because I think any therapist
Absolutely, right.
I would imagine that your therapist would say, let's revisit this next session and dissect what's happening here. But if that does not happen, you also have the ability to do it and say, I want to say to you, I actually felt guilty about how I addressed you in our last session. And these are the things I felt guilty for. I started calling you names. I became very defensive. I refused to listen to the things that you said. I want you to know my intention was, I felt the need to self-protect because I didn't feel heard. And I felt like you weren't listening and I disagreed with you. But I can also own that my delivery and my approach could have been more respectable. And I think that's okay in any relationship, even if it's not a therapeutic one, right? Yeah. So that's why I say this particular question of, should I feel guilty? It's nuanced, right? Because like I said, guilt means I did something bad. And if we are people who are trying to grow, we might assess and realize I did actually make a mistake. And that's why this guilt is heavy. Or we might have to reflect and say, no, I'm just feeling conditioned to feel guilty because every time I stand up for myself, people make it seem like I'm the villain. Mm-hmm. And so now I'm being guilt tripped, especially when you are used to being stifled and being a people pleaser. The moment you start to step out of those tendencies, you're going to have people around you who will guilt trip you and who will try to make you feel bad for owning your truth and speaking up. So it really often always goes back to us identifying the root of that guilt and deciding what steps need to be taken to move forward.
Yeah, I love that you say that. Like, I have my own guilt trip family members, right? That always.
Oh, it's always a family.
Listen, oh my gosh. I'm like, oh yes, I know what you're talking about there. What about if there's the individual, she says she felt guilty. You have some people that will feel guilty and then not come back to session and then ghost the therapist because I am embarrassed of how I act, because that is out of character for me and I can't face you because that's not me. And then I'll just go on to find that. How can we get people to not ghost? I mean, I know it's hard and that does take work. It's not like something that's overnight, especially if that's like you have a history of that. Yeah. But is there any tips that we can give somebody instead of like, hold on, don't ghost your therapist? What can they do instead? I mean, I know we made a list of things, but how can we prevent?
Yeah, I think one of the things I always tell people to reflect on is, how are my choices bringing me closer to the person that I want to be and the growth that I am trying to achieve? Because a lot of the questions you've asked and a lot of the things we're talking about, it literally requires mental reframes. Mm-hmm. I think that we live in a culture that is so consumer facing. We are looking for quick fixes. And so we say, what products can I buy? What new thing can I try? And when it comes to dealing with the discomfort of our choices, and literally the only option is for you to reframe your thinking or sit through that hard thing or do the hard thing, mm-hmm. we run from it. And that's why ghosting happens, because there's nothing on the shelves that you can buy to help you be a better communicator. Right. That's a skill. That's a skill you have to cultivate.
Right.
And there's nothing that you can buy that's going to help someone communicate for you. The only thing that's out there is a cell phone device so that you can pick up the phone and make those calls to have those hard conversations. Okay. And so one of the things I always tell people to start reflecting on is, how are you standing in your own way? If you want to build healthy relationships, how is ghosting and avoiding helping you become the person you want to be? And how is it helping you build community and safe connections? Because if you're looking for a safe space, you're going to do this with one therapist, you're going to find a new one. You might have a disagreement there. And are you just going to keep ghosting and ghosting and ghosting? And now you're like, I done had 6 therapists throughout the year. And what's the common denominator? It's me. Mm-hmm. So at some point, I think people really have to do that reflective work every time they're engaging in a particular habit that's not healthy for them, to ask themselves, how has this pushed me further to being a better person today? And I think that's a self-check-in a lot of us need to sit with on a daily basis. What choices did I make that helped me move the needle? What choices did I make that actually helped me grow an inch today? Mm-hmm. What choices did I make that helped me water myself so that I can bloom and be the person that I want to be tomorrow? And so I think when we have these tendencies to withdraw and avoid and run, we don't realize we are standing in the way of having healthy connections. Mm-hmm. And if this is what you're going to do in a therapeutic relationship to someone who doesn't necessarily, I don't want to say it doesn't owe you something, but it's a different relational contract. This is not a partner. This is not a best friend. This is not a colleague. This is someone who you see probably once or twice a week. And the relationship is a little different. And this is where you can build certain skills. And so I really encourage people to recognize, what value is there? What do you gain from ghosting? Really doing that deep reflective work. And also, how can you learn to manage the fear of having conflict, around conflict, I would say. Mm-hmm. And so recognizing accountability is critical for our growth. Mm-hmm. Ghosting is not accountability. Right. Avoidance is not accountability. And so I think one of the things that people really have to start doing is doing that self-reflective work to understand, how am I growing deeper into the healed parts of myself? And I think sometimes we can do that through, again, our journaling practices, writing these things down, writing down the tough things. I often sometimes encourage people to weigh their pros and cons. What is the pro here that I will get from speaking up and saying, going back and apologizing, going back and having this conversation? And what are the cons? And when we weigh our cons, one of the things I encourage people to do is ask ourselves, how harmful is this thing? Because one of the things we do is we focus on the negatives, but we treat our negatives as extremes. So we say, well, I had an argument with my therapist is going to hate me. Is your therapist really going to hate you? Or is your therapist more so interested to understand what's wrong? Right. Can we talk about this? Right. Like, seriously, you have a history. You've been in therapy for 6 months. You've been going weekly for the last 6 months. But all of a sudden, your therapist is going to hate you. Right. Think of how that's extreme thinking, and that's a cognitive distortion. Mm-hmm. Going into all or nothing thinking, having black and white thinking, not really focusing on the gray area and saying, there's nuance here. And maybe my therapist was uncomfortable, but that's work my therapist is doing. It's not like I'm responsible for fixing my therapist's emotions either, but we can have this conversation. So I really just encourage people to do that deeper work of asking themselves, how can I grow deeper into the person I'm trying to be? And reflect on it. Write that down. Talk about it out loud through the audio journaling, weighing your pros and cons, bringing those letters to your therapist. If you can't verbally say it, you're struggling, write that note, bring it to therapy. I even encourage people in between sessions, write an email so that your therapist can see, oh, we need to address this during our next session, right? Because I think that disconnect helps people to feel safe, and it helps people learn how to grow into dealing with conflict. So I'll even say, after the session, send an email to your therapist. And then once you disconnect from the email, you don't really have to re-engage until you see the person, but at least your therapist is aware in advance and they can guide the session next time you see them. So I would encourage people to do those little things in between sessions as well to build up the courage. But the last thing I'll say is think about when you get ghosted and think about how it feels for you to be the person that people just disappear and withdraw from you, and how that feels, because it's not a comfortable feeling.
Right.
And do you want to do that to others?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. It's such a good topic. I mean, even though we were talking about guilt for having an argument, we hit on so many different things, right? More
Right.
than just you being in therapy and feeling guilty about an argument. Like, I think so many people can learn from this. So thank you for that. So what's your favorite season?
Oh, spring,
Why?
definitely. I like the feeling of knowing summer is coming, but I also just like the weather. I mean, I live in New York City as well, so I'm going through all the transitions of the
Uh-huh.
season. But I think coming, for me, it's more so not just the temperature, but coming out of what feels like brutal winter and then looking forward to beautiful summer. I think spring sits very well into that transition of kind of coming out of the darkness and going into the light. So I feel like that's why spring is like a season that I just love.
Gotcha. What's your favorite book?
Oh my God. Okay. So my favorite book is The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. However, she also has another book called The Mothers. They're both fiction, but The Vanishing Half I highly recommend.
Okay. Favorite state you've ever visited?
Oh, favorite state. See, I'm in New York City and I tend to visit the DMV a lot. So that's DC, Maryland, and Virginia. But I love all just put me somewhere in the DMV and I'm happy.
Okay. Favorite color?
Oh, that's hard because I love so many colors. I will say I love how I look in black. So I'm going to go with black.
Okay. Last one. Favorite vacation?
Wow. Favorite vacation I've been on so far.
Where did you go? What did you do?
This is a good question. I'm torn between two places.
Okay, we'll take both of them. What is it?
Paris and Los Cabos, Mexico. Paris, that was my first time in Europe. So I think experiencing European vibes, the culture, just the architect, everything about it was just so beautiful. And I think like the culture of just like the people, the late night vibes, everyone was super friendly. It felt like I was in New York City, but in Europe. And it just felt like a beautiful experience. So I would probably visit Paris numerous times. But Cabos, I just thought it was a beautiful place. Well, at least the resort I stayed on, I thought was beautiful. But I think I really enjoyed that vacation because I was able to relax the way I really, really wanted to. Sit poolside by the beach, eat my chips and guac, have my drink.
Yes.
So I love me once, sometimes I love like the city vibes. So when I'm in Paris, there's lots of walking, you're going to be busy, but having those relaxing vacations are important. So I would say those two places have been like the top places so far.
Thank you so much for joining us. Before we go, again, remind people who you are, what you do, and how they can find you.
So I'm Minaa B. I am a licensed mental health professional. You can find me on Instagram at Minaa_B. That's MINAA_B. You can also visit my website where I host workshops and trainings. My website is www.minaab.com. And stay tuned for more announcements because I am releasing my first book in August 2023. So we have a long way to go. But yes, thank you. We have a long way to go, but on my Instagram as well as on my website, you will find more updates as we get closer to pre-order sales. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and staying in touch.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.